Welcome back. There is a category of revenge that never raises its voice. It does not arrive as a confrontation in a parking lot or a speech delivered across a courtroom gallery. It arrives as a resume, as a handshake with the right woman at the right moment, as a recommendation letter signed by someone who was never supposed to know your name. I have been reviewing scripts for years, and the one I am about to share operates entirely in that register. The protagonist does not scream. She networks. The weapon is a sorority pin she was deliberately made to miss. And the particular brilliance of it is that the people who stole it from her never understood what they were actually holding. You are watching Historical Manhwa. The first thing Elise Vance noticed was the smell. Cheap detergent and something faintly floral. The kind of floral that comes from a plug-in air freshener left too long in its socket until the scent becomes almost synthetic, almost chemical, a performance of freshness rather than the thing itself. The ceiling above her was textured drywall, not the smooth white plaster of the apartment she'd lived in for the last 4 years in Chicago. There was a water stain in the upper left corner, shaped loosely like the state of Ohio, and she had once spent an entire sleepless Sunday staring at it, willing it to tell her something useful. She was 20 again. She knew it before she sat up. She knew it the way you know a dream has ended, not through any single piece of evidence, but through the specific total quality of the air. The dorm room at Hartwell University smelled like her roommate's dry shampoo and a half-eaten granola bar left on the desk, and the particular anxiety of a Tuesday night in October, 4 days before midterms and exactly 12 hours before the most important event of Elise's first life. Sigma Omicron Theta initiation, 11:15 p.m., the old chapel on the East Lawn. She sat up slowly. The bed frame creaked. Across the narrow room, in the other twin bed, Serena Whitmore was asleep on her side. Dark hair fanned across the pillow, one hand tucked under her cheek in the practiced pose of a woman who'd learned early that being watched while sleeping was just another form of performance. Elise watched her for a long moment. She did not feel rage. She had felt rage in her first life, many times, and for many years. What she felt now was something cooler and more useful. The particular clarity of a woman who already knows how the story ends and has decided, quietly, to write a different one. 12 hours. She lay back down and stared at the Ohio-shaped stain on the ceiling and began, very carefully, to remember everything. She had died on a Thursday in March, 32 years old, outside a parking garage in the West Loop. Not dramatically. There had been no villain, no grand confrontation, only a patch of black ice and a car that had been making a sound she'd been meaning to have checked for 2 months. The last thing she'd thought, asked in the half-second before impact, was that she had never been officially initiated into Sigma Omicron Theta, and that this meant she had never had access to the alumni network, and that this small, bureaucratic absence had shaped the entire architecture of the 12 years that preceded it. That was the thing about the Sigma Omicron Theta network. From the outside, it looked like brunch and Instagram posts and women in blazers clinking glasses at alumni events. Saw it from the inside, and Elise had spent her entire first professional life pressing her face against the glass of that inside, watching through other people's mentions and LinkedIn connections and the offhand references dropped in interviews she didn't get. It was a machine. Victoria Langford, class of 1995, was the managing partner of Meridian & Cross, one of the 5 most powerful corporate law firms in the country. She had made it her personal project to recruit from the SOT network every hiring cycle for 20 years. Diana Chu, class of 2002, was the CFO of the Halcyon Group. She had hired 4 financial forensics specialists in the last decade, and 3 of them had the small gold pin of Sigma Omicron Theta somewhere in their apartment. Priya Mehta, class of 2008, was currently serving her 2nd Senate term and chaired the subcommittee on financial oversight. Judge Eleanor Stokes, class of 1991, had clerked on the 2nd Circuit and still attended the annual fall gathering in the Connecticut house that had been in the chapter's family for 60 years. These were not coincidences. This was infrastructure. In her first life, Elise had not been initiated. She had spent the night of October 14th, her senior year, in a hospital waiting room with bad fluorescent lights and a cup of vending machine coffee that tasted like burnt metal, waiting to hear whether Serena's appendix had ruptured. It had not ruptured. In fact, it had not been in any danger of rupturing. The pain Serena had reported at 11 p.m., conveniently, 45 minutes before Elise was supposed to leave for the chapel, had been real in the sense that Serena had chosen to feel it, had convinced herself of it the way people with a particular kind of desperation sometimes can, and had dissolved by 2 a.m. without explanation. The ER doctor had found nothing. Serena had cried with relief and squeezed Elise's hand and said, "You're the best friend I have ever had. You know that? You know I would do the same for you." Elise had believed her. She had spent the next 12 years believing a version of Serena that Serena had never actually been. She had excused the internship recommendations Serena had quietly redirected toward herself. She had excused the introduction at the Hartwell Alumni Gala that Serena had orchestrated in such a way that Elise left with no business cards, and Serena left with 2 new mentors. She had excused the boyfriend, eventually, though that one had taken longer, had required the specific humiliation of finding the texts on a Tuesday morning in February when she'd borrowed his phone to call a cab, and had required her to sit with the knowledge for 6 full hours before she could put it down and decide what to do with it. She had spent her first life believing that talent and hard work operated on their own merits, that the right opportunity would find her if she was good enough and patient enough and present enough. She had been good. She had worked very hard. She had been extraordinarily patient. None of it had mattered in the way she'd believed it would. And because the right opportunity does not move through the air on its own. It moves through networks, through rooms. You have to have a key to enter. And the key to the particular set of rooms that mattered most to Elise had been withheld from her on the night of October 14th by a woman who had understood, with the cold instinct of someone who has always assessed the world in terms of advantage, exactly what she was taking. Now Elise was 20 again, and it was 3:17 in the morning. Sun and initiation was in 8 hours, and she was going. She had never been more certain of anything. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought through the shape of the next 12 years with the methodical precision of someone mapping a legal strategy, because that was what she was, in some essential and unalterable way. She had graduated with a law degree in her first life, had passed the bar, Slay had worked for 4 years at a mid-sized firm in Chicago, doing M&A support work that interested her and paid adequately and meant nothing in terms of trajectory, because she had no network and the firm's partner track was a quiet form of aristocracy that she had not understood until it was too late. In her second life, she would pass the bar again. She would do this quickly and without drama. But the degree was not the point. The network was the point. She thought about Victoria Langford. Salty in her first life, Elise had met Victoria exactly once at a Hartwell alumni event in Chicago that she'd attended on the strength of a general invitation rather than a personal one. Victoria had been at the center of a cluster of women, all of them laughing at something, all of them wearing the kind of effortless that takes money and practice and the specific confidence of someone who has never had to wonder if they belong. Elise had stood at the edge of that cluster for approximately 4 minutes before quietly retrieving her coat from the check-in table and taking the train home. She knew now what she had not known then, that Victoria Langford had graduated from Hartwell in 1995, had been president of the Sigma Omicron Theta chapter during her senior year, and had personally shepherded 17 women into positions at Meridian and Cross over the course of 2 decades. She knew that Victoria hosted a private dinner every January for SOT alumni in the legal field, and that the January dinner was where case assignments got whispered, where secondments got arranged, where the kind of professional acceleration that looks like merit from the outside got quietly coordinated. She also knew this was the part that mattered most, that Victoria Langford had a specific weakness for women who combined genuine legal intelligence with what Victoria called strategic instinct, meaning the ability to see not just the immediate legal problem, but the financial architecture beneath it. This was the thing Elise had developed in her first life out of necessity, from years of doing M&A work without support and reading financial forensics literature in her spare time because she was fascinated by it. She had gotten very good at it. She had simply never been in a room where it could be demonstrated to the right person. She was going to be in those rooms now. But first, 8 hours. The morning light came in through the gap in the curtain as a single thin stripe across the linoleum floor. Elise watched it widen as the hours passed. At 6, she made coffee with the small machine on her desk, the kind with the pods. though she'd never liked pod coffee, and now, with 12 additional years of taste memory, liked it even less. It tasted like an approximation of the thing it was supposed to be. She drank it anyway and sat at her desk reading her corporate law textbook, not because she needed to, but because the motion of it was settling, the familiar weight of case precedent and its language. Oh, and because she was aware that she was 20 years old again, in a body that remembered everything, and she needed to be careful about how that manifested. It would not do to seem different. Not yet. Serena woke at 8, stretched with her arms overhead, and said, in the sleepy, careless voice she'd always used with Elise, because she had long ago determined that Elise required no performance. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Elise said. Initiation nerves. Serena smiled. "Yeah, you're going to do great." She said it the way she always said things like that. Warmly, easily, with the specific warmth of someone whose warmth has been calibrated to produce a desired effect. Elise smiled back. She had gotten very good at smiling in 12 additional years of practice. The day passed. They went to class together, ate lunch in the campus dining hall, where the overhead lights hummed at a frequency that had always made Elise feel slightly underwater, and studied together in the library in the afternoon. Their textbooks spread across opposite ends of a long oak table, while the October light moved across the windows in slow gold panels. At 4:30, Serena's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and something crossed her face, so brief and so small that the 20-year-old Elise had completely missed it. Before she answered, "Hey, Mom." A pause. I know, I am going tonight." Another pause, longer. "Because it matters, okay? Alex, it actually matters to me." She hung up and sat for a moment with her phone face down on the table, and then she looked up at Elise and smiled her calibrated smile and said, "Sorry, family stuff. Everything okay?" "Fine." She picked up her highlighter. "Everything is fine." Elise watched her for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She did not say anything. She went back to her textbook. She had spent 12 years not knowing that this phone call had been part of it. That Serena's mother, Actus, who was a complicated woman with complicated finances and a specific interest in her daughter's social ascent, had called that afternoon to discuss the plan. That the plan had been in place for a week, since the moment it became clear that Elise's initiation would give her access to a network that Serena had already begun, with the cold efficiency of someone who sees the world as a resource allocation problem to map. Serena was not cruel exactly. She was strategic. She had grown up in a household where money was discussed as openly as weather, where the language of advantage was the primary language, where her mother had once said, with perfect earnestness, that friendship is fine, but connection is functional. Serena had absorbed this the way children absorb the air of the rooms they grow up in. She was not malicious. She was practical, in the way that can look indistinguishable from malice when you are on the receiving end of it. Elise understood all of this now, at 32, in a 20-year-old's body, sitting in the library while the October light moved across the windows and her former best friend highlighted marketing theory 4 feet away. Understanding it did not require forgiving it. At 9 p.m., Elise went back to their room to change. The dress for initiation was white, not the bright white of something new, but the soft, particular white of cotton that had been washed many times. The kind that reads as intention rather than display. She'd bought it at a consignment shop in September in her first life, and kept it carefully folded in the back of her closet for 6 weeks against this night, and then had not worn it. Had folded it back into its bag and donated it 2 years later when she couldn't stand looking at it anymore. In this life, she had bought it again, same shop, same careful folding, and now she put it on and looked at herself in the back of the door mirror and felt something settle in her chest. Not sentimentality, but something like purpose, which in her experience was better and more durable. Serena was lying on her bed scrolling through her phone when Elise came out of the bathroom. "You look nice," Serena said, without looking up. "Thanks." At 10:45, Serena looked up. "Hey." Something shifted in her face. Not the calibrated warmth. Something underneath it. Something tighter. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Elise put on her earrings, small gold hoops she'd had since high school. "Sure." "Can you feel that? On the right side, kind of like a pulling in my abdomen?" Serena sat up slowly, one hand pressed to her side. It's probably nothing. It's just, I've had it since this afternoon and it's getting kind of sharp. There it was. Elise turned from the mirror and looked at her. In her first life, she had not hesitated. She had moved immediately, had said, "Do you want to go to the health center?" Had made the decision in the span of a heartbeat. The way you make decisions when your framework is that the person in front of you is telling the truth. She had texted her pledge sisters to say she wouldn't be there, had received back a string of worried messages, and then, as the hours in the waiting room stretched, a silence that was its own kind of answer. She looked at Serena now, and she looked with 12 additional years of information layered over the looking. She looked at the hand pressed to the side, which was the right position, but the angle was slightly off for appendicitis. Too low, too anterior, too much like someone who had Googled the symptom rather than someone experiencing it. She looked at the tightness around Serena's eyes, which was real but was the tightness of anxiety, not pain. She looked at the phone on the bed, face down, yawned and thought about the call at 4:30. "I'm going to call your mom," Elise said. "You should tell her what's happening." Something very brief and very precise passed through Serena's face. "She's probably asleep." "It's not even 11. She'll want to know." Elise reached for her own phone. "No, don't worry her. It's probably nothing. Serena stood, and the movement was careful in the way the movement of someone performing pain is careful, and it was structured around the anticipated observation of it rather than around the pain itself. "Maybe we should just go to the ER just in case." "What are your other symptoms?" A pause. "What?" "You said you've had it since this afternoon. Have you had nausea? Fever? Has the pain moved at all? Does it feel different when you push on it directly versus when you release?" Elise asked this calmly, in the tone of someone consulting a pre-medical textbook, at which she had in fact read thoroughly in the weeks leading up to this night. Another pause, longer. I'm not sure," Serena said. "Okay." Elise set her phone down. "Here's the thing, Serena. Classic appendicitis usually presents with pain that starts periumbilical and migrates to the right lower quadrant. It typically accompanies low-grade fever and sometimes nausea. The Rovsing's sign, Slafas, that's when pressure on the left side of the abdomen produces pain on the right, is pretty diagnostic. Yosh, can I check?" She took a step forward. Serena took a small step back. The performance was fracturing at the edges, and they could both see it. Elise did not say anything. She picked up her small clutch, her student ID, her keys. "I think," she said quietly, not unkindly, "that if you're genuinely in pain, you should call the campus nurse line. The number is on the back of the student handbook. If it gets worse, go to the health center. I'll have my phone on." She opened the door. "Oh, Elise." Serena's voice, stripped of the calibration, sounded younger, more like the person she actually was when she wasn't being the person she decided to become. I don't feel well. I'm just saying I don't feel well." "I know," Elise said. She was not cruel about it. She did not need to be. "I'll text you when I'm on my way back." She closed the door behind her. The night was cold. Oh, the particular clean cold of a northeastern October that smells like dying leaves and the first premonition of winter that gets into your hair and your coat lining and follows you inside. The east lawn was dark, the path marked only by the distant light from the chapel's old stained glass windows, which from outside made them look warmly lit from within, amber and burgundy and a deep saturated green. Elise walked toward it with her hands in her coat pockets and her white dress showing below the coat's hem. And she thought about nothing. Not Serena, not her first life, not the 12 years of careful maneuvering that would need to begin now. She thought only about the sound of her own footsteps on the path, and the cold, and the light in the chapel windows, and the way the night smelled like leaves. Oh, she was 20 years old and she was going to her initiation. And she was going to do this correctly, and everything that came after would be built on this foundation, and it would be solid, because she had taken the time to understand exactly what she was building. The chapel door was old oak, iron-hinged, and it made a sound when she pushed it open that was halfway between a creak and a note. Low and resonant, the door's way of acknowledging the occasion. Inside, 11 women in white dresses stood in a semicircle on the worn wooden floor, candles in hand. The stained glass threw its amber and green across their faces, and the smell was beeswax and old paper, and the faint mineral smell of stone, the smell of a room that has been witness to a long series of intentions. At the center of the semicircle stood the chapter president, Clara Min, 22, and composed and wearing the SOT pin like a period at the end of a careful sentence. Clara looked at Elise for a moment when she walked in, then nodded once. Elise took her place in the semicircle. The ceremony was 40 minutes long. She had tried to imagine it many times in her first life, had reconstructed pieces of it from things her pledge sisters had said in the years before they quietly stopped including her in the things that mattered. Now she stood in it and let it be real. The language of it, which was old and formal and built on a framework of obligation and reciprocity. The candle warm in her hand, the moment when the pin was placed on the fabric of her white dress with the small, decisive click of its clasp. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried at things she had worked for. She simply stood very still and felt the weight of the pin and thought, now. The first 2 years of her second life at Hartwell were not the easiest years she had ever lived. Oh, but they were the most efficient. She kept Serena as a roommate for the remainder of that year without drama, because she understood that social stability was its own form of strategy, and that a sudden rupture would require energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. She was civil, warm enough, present without being intimate. She deflected the conversations where Serena pressed toward the closeness they had previously had, not with coldness, but with busyness. Oh, with the credible preoccupation of a woman who was genuinely occupied. She was, in fact, genuinely occupied. She was rebuilding. The SOT network at the chapter level was not the network that mattered. What mattered was the alumni infrastructure, which operated through a series of annual events, a mentorship program, a private listserv that required an official verification of initiation status to join, and the informal web of referrals and recommendations that ran through all of it, like a current through a wire. To access that current, you had to be verified, and to be verified, you had to have done it right, and Elise had done it right, and now she began to work. She applied to the SOT mentorship program in November of her junior year, selecting from the mentor list with the same care she'd applied to everything since her rebirth. She did not select the most prominent name on the list, which would have been obvious, nor did she select someone whose background was entirely aligned with her own interests, which would have been unimaginative. She selected Donna Osei, class of 2004, currently the head of litigation support at a corporate intelligence firm in New York, whose work sat precisely at the intersection of legal analysis and financial investigation, and who had given a lecture at the school's law department 3 months prior that Elise had attended and asked 3 questions Dana had specifically noted in the brief thank you email she'd sent to the department coordinator, which Elise had, through a graduate assistant she'd become friendly with, obtained a copy of. Donna Osei remembered her. So the mentorship call in January lasted 45 minutes longer than the program's recommended structure. Dana asked Elise about her interest in financial forensics, not as a courtesy, as genuine curiosity. And Elise explained, with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years in a first life actually doing the work, exactly what fascinated her about the way financial fraud leaves structural evidence in transaction patterns, in the way capital moves through subsidiary layers, which in the specific language of accounting entries made under pressure versus at leisure. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How old are you?" 21. A pause. "I want to introduce you to someone." The someone was not Victoria Langford. Not yet. The someone was Margot Hill, class of 2007, who ran a boutique forensic accounting practice in Boston and who was looking for a second-year law student to do a summer placement. The placement paid adequately and would require Elise to live in Boston for 3 months on a graduate stipend, which meant she would be in a studio apartment in Somerville with a hot plate and a fold-out chair and windows that looked out onto a fire escape where a neighboring tenant kept an extremely tenacious potted fern. She took the placement without hesitation. Margot Hill's firm, Hill & Associates, almost occupied the 3rd floor of a building in the financial district that smelled in the lobby of coffee and cleaning solution, and the particular institutional anxiety of a place where people worked very hard under significant scrutiny. The elevator was slow and made a sound between floors that Elise cataloged on her first day as something that should probably be reported to building management. The office itself was nothing. Low ceilings, fluorescent lighting, eyelid desks arranged in rows of two with monitors so old that one of them had a small crack in the lower right corner that someone had sealed with clear tape. The tape now yellowed and beginning to peel. None of this mattered. What mattered was that the work that happened in this room was real, consequential, and executed with a level of rigor that Elise had never encountered in any of the corporate environments of her first life. Margot Hill was small and unhurried and wore the same style of dark blazer in apparently unlimited rotation, and she had a specific way of annotating financial documents in red pen in a tiny, dense script that looked at first like decoration and turned out on examination to be a complete analytical system. That Elise spent the first 3 weeks of the placement studying when Margot left the documents on her desk for filing. She was not supposed to be reading those documents. She read them. On the 4th week, Margot put a file folder on Elise's desk and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you see." The file was a subsidiary ledger from a mid-size pharmaceutical distribution company, 3 years of quarterly records, unremarkable on its face. Elise spent 2 hours with it. She found 4 things: a pattern of intercompany transfers that clustered on the last business day of each quarter with a regularity that suggested active management rather than organic activity, and a discrepancy in the treatment of certain receivables that was too consistent to be error, a shell entity in the footnotes that appeared twice under different names but with identifying numbers 1 digit apart, and a timing pattern in the executive expense reports that corresponded with the transfer dates in a way that would be, in any competent forensic investigation, worth noting. She wrote these up in a half-page memo. She was clean about it. Just observation, just the numbers. No conclusions she couldn't directly support. Margot read the memo in 3 minutes. Then she looked up and said, in a tone entirely absent of the warmth that Elise had come to understand was not Margot's primary mode, "Dana told me you were sharp." She was kind. Elise thought that, so it said. She wasn't being kind. She was being accurate. Margot set the memo down. "Come in at 7 tomorrow. And I want to show you something." What Margot showed her over the next 2 months was the methodology of financial forensics at its full extension. The way you build a map of a fraudulent structure from the outside in, starting with what the documents show and working backward through the logic of what they must be hiding. The way a negative space in a filing is itself a form of evidence. The way the absence of certain transactions in a ledger can be as diagnostic as their presence. She showed her how to use SEC filings as a baseline and how to identify when a company's reported figures were internally inconsistent in ways that the filing itself concealed through strategic aggregation. She showed her the specific forensic tests. Benford's law analysis, which examines the distribution of leading digits in financial data and flags populations where the distribution deviates from what naturally occurring numbers produce. Variance analysis on intercompany transfer pricing. The particular profile of round number transactions, which cluster in fraudulent records with a frequency that genuine business activity does not produce. Elise absorbed all of this with the focused attention of someone for whom it was not new, but had never been this organized, this methodical, this named and sequenced and explained. She had done versions of this work in her first life from instinct, from reading, only from the specific compensation mechanism of someone who has talent they have never had a proper environment for. Now, she had an environment and a teacher, and she was, in the specific way that people become when they encounter the thing they were supposed to be doing, very fast. At the end of the summer, Margot gave her a letter of recommendation that was 2 paragraphs long. The second paragraph read, and in full, "Miss Vance demonstrates the analytical capacity and professional judgment of someone several years her senior. She is specifically gifted in the identification of structural anomalies in complex financial data, and she has the rare quality of being able to work backward from evidence to structure without losing evidentiary discipline in the process. She will be, for the right firm, an exceptional asset. I recommend her without qualification." Elise kept a copy of this letter in the back of her document folder for 4 years. She graduated in May, top 15% of her law class, which was not the very top, but was respectable and was not, in any case, the metric that mattered most. What mattered most was the network she had spent 3 years building with the precision of someone laying track, not aggressively, not in a way that read as strategy rather than genuine engagement, but consistently and with the specific attention that real relationships require. She had attended every SOT alumni event that was accessible to active chapter members. She had made herself useful at them in specific low-ego ways, volunteering for setup, keeping notes, following up on introductions with personalized emails that demonstrated she'd paid attention to the actual content of the conversations rather than just the names. She had developed, over 3 years, real relationships with 6 alumni in fields adjacent to law, and through them had met perhaps 30 women who would recognize her name, had read her work, or had some specific reason to think well of her. Victoria Langford was not among them. This was intentional. Elise had calculated that approaching Victoria directly, as a student, was not the right move. Victoria saw dozens of students a year. To approach from below, from the position of supplicant, was to risk becoming one of the dozens. So the correct approach was lateral, to become someone whose name Victoria encountered through people whose judgment Victoria already trusted, in contexts where the endorsement was incidental rather than lobbied for. She engineered this with patience. At the annual fall gathering in Connecticut, in October of her first year post-graduation, a gathering to which she had been invited as a recent initiate, the invitation passing through Dana, who had extended it casually over email as though it were a small thing, she positioned herself carefully. Not near Victoria, near the women who circled Victoria, the mid-career lawyers and finance professionals who formed the connective tissue between the chapter's older and newer generations. And she let herself be known to them as simply, specifically interesting. She wore, at that gathering, a dark green dress that cost the equivalent of half a week's salary from her new associate position at a small but reputable firm in New York. And she wore it with the comfort of someone who had earned it, rather than the anxiety of someone who had spent beyond their means to appear otherwise. Which is its own signal, that comfort, one that people register without naming. She arrived early and left late, and in the hours between did the thing she had always been best at. She listened. She asked questions that demonstrated that she had thought about the problem before speaking. She did not overstay any single conversation. She did not perform. It was at the end of that evening, near the coat check, that Victoria Langford turned to the woman she was standing with, Margot Hill, who had driven up from Boston and whom Elise had greeted warmly and specifically upon arrival, and said, in a tone pitched precisely between casual and deliberate, "Is that the one you wrote about?" And Margot had said, "The very one." And Victoria had looked at Elise with the particular attention of a woman who has assessed talent professionally for 25 years and said, "Come to dinner next month. The January dinner, can you make it?" "Yes," Elise said. "Thank you." She drove back to New York that night in her used sedan, which had a heating system that worked intermittently and a radio that picked up one frequency with any clarity. A classical station that played, for most of the drive, a Schubert piano sonata in a major that she had never listened to carefully before, and that she listened to now, in the dark on the highway, with the focused attention she was currently bringing to most things. She had been waiting for this for 12 years. She allowed herself, in the car, alone in the dark, 5 minutes of something that was not quite joy but was adjacent to it, the specific satisfaction of a correctly executed strategy at a critical junction. Then the Schubert moved into its final movement, and she stopped feeling it and started thinking about what came next. The January dinner was held in a townhouse on the Upper East Side that belonged to one of the older alumnae, a woman in her late 60s named Frances Beckett, who had made a significant amount of money in real estate development in the 90s and now operated primarily as a network node. A person who existed within the SOT structure as a gathering place, whose home was itself a form of infrastructure. The townhouse was not ostentatious. It was old and high-ceilinged and slightly formal in the way that old money spaces are formal, with rugs that had probably been expensive when they were new and were now simply dignified, and bookshelves that held things people had actually read, and a dining room table long enough to seat 14 women without crowding. The food was good in the way that home cooking is good when the cook is skilled and not performing. A beef stew that had been going since morning, bread that was warm from the oven and left in a basket with a clean cloth over it. Wine, from a case rather than a bottle. Oz poured without ceremony. Elise sat across from a woman named Patricia Wren, who was a second-year associate at a securities litigation firm and who had graduated from Hartwell 4 years ahead of Elise, and 2 seats down from a woman named Camille Okafor, who had left corporate law 3 years prior to run the compliance division of a major investment bank. She was placed at neither end of the table, which would have been too prominent, nor in the middle, which would have been forgettable. She was placed where the most interesting conversations were likely to happen, and she understood this as its own form of invitation. Victoria Langford sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking at her phone. This was notable, Elise thought. This was a woman who was paying attention to the room. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Over the course of those 3 hours, Elise had 4 sustained conversations that mattered. Oh, and she prosecuted each one with the full force of what she actually knew. Not performance, not the attempt to impress, the actual knowledge, the actual analysis, the specific quality of engagement that comes from having spent years thinking carefully about a subject. She talked to Patricia about a recent Delaware Chancery Court ruling on the duty of loyalty in the context of conflicting fiduciary obligations. And she said something about it that Patricia found interesting enough to write down on the back of a business card. She talked to Camille about the inadequacy of current SEC guidance on related party transaction disclosure in situations involving complex beneficial ownership structures. And she said it in a way that was specific and documented and not simply critical, which Camille noted and which moved the conversation forward rather than allowing it to stall on the critique. Victoria. Al, from the far end of the table, was not appearing to listen. Victoria was eating and talking to Frances about something Elise could not hear. But 3 times over the course of the dinner, Elise felt the specific quality of peripheral attention, the kind that looks like inattention, but is in fact its most concentrated form. And 3 times she continued speaking to the person in front of her without adjusting, without turning toward it, either without doing the thing that people who want to be noticed do, which is to subtly perform for the observer. She knew this move. She had watched it done to her in her first life many times. She knew how to dismantle it. At the end of the dinner, while the women were gathering coats and saying their goodbyes in the front hall, Victoria Langford appeared at Elise's elbow and said, without preamble, "What do you know about transfer pricing disputes in cross-border M&A?" "Quite a bit," Elise said. "Specifically, there's a matter I've been thinking about for a client. A target company with intercompany licensing arrangements that look clean in isolation, but I've been finding the aggregate pricing behavior harder to explain than I'd like. Come to the office next week. I'd like your read on it." "I'm available Thursday or Friday," Elise said. "Friday at 9. Victoria turned back to her hostess conversation without a transitional sentence. This was, Elise had come to understand, Victoria's specific language. The conversation ending without ceremony was its own form of respect, the assumption that the other person understood the significance of what had just been said and did not require it underlined. She put on her coat and walked out into the January night. The street was quiet, the traffic moving slowly in the cold, the lights of the brownstones warm and amber against the dark. Her breath made small clouds. She walked half a block before she stopped and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her pockets, just standing. Friday at 9. She started walking again. The matter at Meridian and Cross was not, on its face, what it turned out to be. It was presented to Elise as a due diligence review on a mid-size pharmaceutical distribution company that Meridian's client, a private equity firm, was considering acquiring. The company was called Whitmore Distribution Partners. As the name registered, distantly, in some part of her mind, but she cataloged it and moved on, because in the first week there was too much to process to follow every thread. The due diligence package was 3,400 pages. She read all of it. By the end of the first week, she had identified 7 items she wanted to understand better. By the end of the second week, she had reduced this to 3 items that were genuinely anomalous. By the end of the third week, she had working from public filings cross-referenced against the package materials and a set of financial databases that Meridian subscribed to through its forensic services partner, identified a pattern. She drafted a 12-page memorandum. She sat with the memorandum for 2 days before she gave it to Victoria. She gave it to Victoria on a Thursday afternoon at the end of a brief check-in meeting, and setting it on the desk with the specific quiet of someone handing over something that has been evaluated carefully and found to be what it appears to be. Victoria read the first page, the third page, the seventh page. Then she went back to the beginning and read it through completely. This took 16 minutes. Elise sat in the chair across the desk and looked at the middle distance and did not fidget. When Victoria put the memo down, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How confident are you in the transfer pricing analysis on page 8? Very confident in the pattern. The specific quantum would require access to the intercompany agreements, which aren't in the package. The pattern is visible from the filing data and is internally consistent across 6 quarters. And the beneficial ownership structure on page 11. I cross-referenced 3 data sources. The intermediate holding entity links to a Cayman structure that, based on the filing dates and the registered agent, is consistent with a family trust established in 2009. The 2009 date is important because it predates the acquisition of the main subsidiary by 4 months. Victoria picked up her pen, set it down. You understand what you're describing? Yes. You understand that if this is what it appears to be, we are not talking about a due diligence flag. We are talking about a referral. I understand. And you're comfortable with that? I am, Elise said. The evidence is documented and sourced, and I would stand behind any of it in a regulatory filing. Victoria looked at her for one long assessing moment. Not the way people look when they are deciding whether to trust you, but the way they look when the decision has already been made, and they are simply registering its finality. All right, she said. Good work. I'm going to need you to prepare the regulatory referral package. I'll supervise directly. Elise nodded and stood. One more thing, Victoria said. She paused. You said Whitmore Distribution Partners the first time you referenced the company name. This afternoon you said the company. Why did you stop using the name? Elise held this for 1 beat. 2. Because I realized I know the family name, she said. From college. Well, I wanted to be sure the analysis wasn't colored by that. Victoria nodded once, with the specific respect of someone who understands what professional discipline costs. Is it colored? No, Elise said. It isn't? She had not, in her second life, maintained any real friendship with Serena Whitmore. The split after initiation night had been quiet. No confrontation, no scene, just the slow, natural withdrawal of 2 people who had, upon examination, less in common than previously assumed. Serena had moved on with what Elise assessed, from a distance, as minimal disruption. She was socially gifted in the way that certain people who do not invest deeply in individual relationships are gifted, able to sustain a wide social network on the surface density of frequent contact and shared amusement. She had graduated with a business degree, but had joined her father's company in some capacity that the company's website described as Director of Strategic Development, and had by all external measures moved through her mid-20s with the smooth momentum of someone whose infrastructure was intact. The infrastructure, it now turned out, had fractures in it that went all the way through. Elise spent 4 weeks building the regulatory referral package. She worked with the specific detachment of someone doing a technical task that is also secondarily personal. She was aware of the personal dimension, and she set it aside each morning when she opened the files, and she picked it up again each evening when she closed them. And the picking up and setting down rhythm of it was useful because it meant she was clean in the work and clear in the feeling, and neither contaminated the other. What she had found in 12 pages, and what she now documented across 63 pages of formal regulatory submission, was this: that Whitmore Distribution Partners had been maintaining a set of intercompany transfer pricing arrangements that systematically shifted profits from its U.S. operating subsidiary to a Cayman holding entity, that these arrangements had been structured specifically to avoid the threshold that would have triggered IRS scrutiny under Section 482, that the Cayman entity was beneficially owned through a family trust that named as its primary beneficiary one, Gerald Whitmore, Serena's father, that the practice had been ongoing for 11 years, that it had been reviewed and signed off by the company's external auditor 3 times in that period, and that the auditor was a small regional firm whose managing partner had, in the same period, as received from the Whitmore Family Trust a series of personal consulting fees that had been disclosed nowhere in the audit engagement letters. There was also, supplementary to the main finding, a secondary matter involving the company's securities disclosures. That in 2 separate rounds of private equity fundraising, the company had presented audited financials that reflected the transfer pricing structure as arm's length when the documentation supporting that characterization did not exist. Oaths which constituted, in the most precise statutory language, a material misrepresentation to investors. $47 million. That was the approximate magnitude of the tax liability that the structure had avoided over 11 years. The investor misrepresentation matter had a separate liability profile that Elise documented separately and flagged for Victoria's assessment. She submitted the package to Victoria on a Monday morning, printed and bound with a cover page that said, in the plain, "Is informative style of regulatory documents simply referral package, Whitmore Distribution Partners, potential violations, IRC Section 482, Securities Act Section 11." She placed it on Victoria's assistant's desk and sent a brief email noting its submission, and then she went back to her office and started working on the 3 other files that were active on her desk. Still, because the work continued regardless of what happened next, and the work was the work. And she had made her peace with the linear nature of good professional execution. Victoria called her in at 2 in the afternoon. "I've reviewed the package," Victoria said. "I'm going to have our tax controversy specialists do a parallel review over the next 2 weeks. If their assessment aligns with yours, we'll proceed with the referral." "Understood." "The scope and quality of this analysis is..." Victoria paused with the hesitation of someone selecting words with care. "Unusual for someone at your stage." "Thank you." "I'm not complimenting you," Victoria said, but her tone was not unkind. "I'm observing a fact. It requires an explanation. How do you know how to do this?" Elise thought about this. She thought about Margot Hill's firm in Boston, about the annotated ledgers and red pen, about the summer she'd spent in the Somerville studio with the fern on the fire escape. She thought about everything before that. "I spent time with people who were good at it," she said, "and I paid attention." Victoria looked at her. "We'll talk about your position here when the review comes back. That's all." Elise stood. At the door, she turned back. "Victoria." "Yes." "I want to flag something. The name on the referral. Whitmore. I know I mentioned this. I want to reiterate formally that I have a prior acquaintance with a member of the Whitmore family. It doesn't affect the analysis, but it's on the record." "Already noted," Victoria said. "I handled the conflict check myself." She nodded and closed the door. The parallel review came back in 17 days. It aligned. Meridian and Cross filed the referral with the IRS Large Business and International Division and, separately, a notification to the SEC's Division of Enforcement. The filing was, by design, not public. These things rarely are. In their early stages. But the mechanism of it moved with the specific momentum of regulatory machinery that has been given good evidence, which is a quiet momentum but an inexorable one. Elise was not involved in what happened after the filing. That was not her work. Her work was the analysis and the documentation and the package, and that was done, and she turned back to the other files and the other clients and the rhythm of the job. And it was 6 weeks later that she received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. "Is this Elise Vance?" The voice was Serena's, stripped of everything, of the warmth, of the calibration, of the easy social fluency that had always been Serena's primary mode, just the voice itself, which turned out to be lower than Elise had ever noticed, and tighter. "This is she. I know it was you." A pause. "I know it was you who..." The voice stopped, recalibrated. My father's company is being investigated. The IRS and the SEC. "I'm aware. You were working on the due diligence for the acquisition." "I'm not able to speak to anything related to pending matters," Elise said with the clean, specific tone of someone who has decided precisely what they will and will not say. "That's standard?" "You could have come to me." The voice now had something in it that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Something at the intersection of the two. The specific quality of someone who has finally understood the shape of their own choices. "I could have talked to my father. I could have..." "Serena," Elise said this quietly. "You called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm at work. I can't speak to anything related to any pending regulatory matter. I think you know this. A long silence. Is this because of initiation? Serena said. After all of it? Is that what this is? This was the question Elise had, meant in some portion of her mind, been waiting for. She considered it with the same care she brought to any question worth considering. No, she said. Then why? Because the numbers were wrong, Elise said, still quietly. That's the only reason. The numbers were wrong, and I documented them, and the documentation went where it was supposed to go. That's how this works. A pause. Get a good attorney, Serena. Not for yourself, the company. Your father needs good counsel. She ended the call and set her phone face down on her desk and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of her office, which was on the 14th floor and looked out over lower Manhattan toward the river, the afternoon light moving across the buildings in long, cold planes. She thought about the dorm room, the Ohio-shaped water stain on the ceiling, the plug-in air freshener, the sound of the chapel door, low and resonant. She thought about the white dress, and which she still had in the back of her closet, folded in its bag from the consignment shop. She picked up her phone and called Dana Osei. I have something for you, she said when Dana answered. Not urgent, but I've been sitting on it. There's a forensic accounting position opening at one of the Halcyon Group's compliance subsidiaries. I got a note about it last week. I think you should put someone from your network in consideration. Dana said, Funny you mentioned that. Oh, I was going to call you. Oh? Diana Chu asked me specifically about you, the CFO. She's looking to expand her forensic advisory capacity, and your name came up at the fall gathering. She wants to meet. Elise looked out the window. The light was still moving across the buildings. A tugboat was making its way upriver, small and deliberate against the gray water. Tell her I'm available, she said. Oh, I'll send you my calendar. She had been at Meridian for 4 months when Victoria offered her a formal position on the Financial Crimes Practice Group. The offer came in the form of a meeting at 6:30 in the evening, when the rest of the floor was quiet. Just the cleaning crew's carts in the hall and the sound of the vacuum somewhere down the corridor. Victoria said, You know what I do, specifically. I build practice areas. I did it with the M&A group in the 90s and with the regulatory group in the aughts. And what I'm building now is a financial crimes and forensic advisory capacity that is going to be, in 10 years, the most significant practice area in corporate law. Not because I say so, because of where the regulatory environment is going and what institutional clients are going to need in that environment. She paused. You understand what I'm describing? Yes, Elise said. I want you in this group from the beginning, not as a contractor, not as a placement. As an associate with a defined path, with supervision from me directly, and with access to the client relationships I've been building for 25 years. In exchange, I need 3 things from you: reliability, discretion, and the quality of analysis you've already demonstrated. That's it. Elise said, Yes, I accept. Good. Victoria stood, which was the signal that the meeting was over. Oh, one more thing. She paused. The Whitmore matter. I want you to know that the quality of that package, not the implications of it, the technical quality of the analysis, was remarked on specifically by the IRS team during the initial assessment call. They noted it. I noted them noting it. I want you to know that. Thank you, Elise said. Victoria looked at her with the direct, calibrating attention she always brought to moments she considered important. You're going to be very good at this, she said. It was not quite a compliment, and it was not quite a statement. It was a prediction made by someone who has never been wrong about these things and knows it. That's all. Elise left the office and took the elevator down and walked out into the October night, which smelled like the city and the beginning of cold and the exhaust of a crosstown bus moving through the intersection with its amber lights glowing. And she walked 3 blocks before she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk with her coat open and her briefcase at her side, and she looked at the street, at the yellow cabs and the bicycle messenger, and the bodega with its cut flowers and the sidewalk buckets, red and gold, and the deep, almost purple of late chrysanthemums. And she thought about something Margot Hill had told her in the office in Boston on the last day of the placement. over the container of leftover coffee that neither of them wanted, but both of them were finishing out of some shared refusal to waste it. Margot had said, "The most important thing in this work is that you understand you are always doing two things at once. You are doing the analysis, and you are building the record. The analysis is for the present, the record is for later. Be very careful about what you put in the record, and be very careful about what you leave out of it. Because what you put in and what you leave out are both decisions, and decisions have consequences, and the consequences last longer than you will." Elise had thought about this many times. She thought about it now, on the sidewalk, with the chrysanthemums in their buckets and the bus disappearing up the avenue. She thought about the 12 pages she had handed to Victoria in September, which were now part of a formal regulatory record and would remain so for the duration of the matter, however that matter resolved. She thought about the 63 pages of the referral package and the specific precision she had brought to every paragraph of it, the sourcing, the cross-referencing, the care with which she had documented not just what the numbers showed, but what they ruled out, so that the record was not merely incriminating, but was airtight. Was the kind of record that does not erode under pressure because it was built to hold weight. Oh, she thought about what building a record means when you have the luxury of having been here before. When you know where the pressure will come, when you know which points will be contested and which will not, when you can see, before anyone else can see it, exactly where the fractures in a structure are going to be, and can document around them in advance. This was, she thought, the particular advantage of what had happened to her. Not rage as an engine, not grief as a fuel. Those burn hot and they burn fast and they leave residue. What she had was something cleaner. Knowledge. The specific, structured, actionable knowledge of a woman who has lived the story once in full and understands from that complete reading exactly where every pivot point falls. She started walking again. The autumn air was cold now, the real cold of late October, and she pulled her coat closed and walked in the direction of the subway. Oh, and the street was loud and bright around her with the specific loud brightness of the city at the hour when the day shifts into evening and everything is briefly both at once. The Whitmore matter moved, as regulatory matters do, with the specific temporality of a geological process. Slow in its overall arc, but capable, at particular moments, of sudden and significant movement. Elise tracked it from a distance, out through the channels that were appropriate to someone who had contributed the initial analysis and was now recused from active involvement. She tracked it the way you track a thing you have set in motion and are no longer required to push. Gerald Whitmore retained counsel in November. The counsel he retained was good. A former DOJ attorney with a strong track record in tax controversy and a specific expertise in transfer pricing defense. And Elise noted this and found it unremarkable. Because the quality of the analysis she'd built meant that the quality of his defense was, in the final accounting, orthogonal to the outcome. You could not contest a Benford's law distribution anomaly consistent across 6 years of quarterly data. You could dispute the interpretation, but you could not make the numbers different. What she had not anticipated, what, in the honest accounting she made of herself, she acknowledged as a genuine gap in her modeling, was Serena. Not Serena's father's counsel. Serena herself. She received the email in December, 6 weeks after the phone call. It was 3 paragraphs, professionally written, with no salutation more personal than Elise, and no close more emotional than "Regards, Serena Whitmore." The first paragraph acknowledged the professional nature of the situation and expressed no grievance about it. The second paragraph described in detail that Elise recognized as having been prepared with legal guidance. All the specific role Serena had played in her father's company, which was, the paragraph explained, a role of nominal title and no operational authority, and which was being documented as such in the formal cooperation submission that Serena's own attorney was preparing in connection with the investigation. The third paragraph said, "I want you to know that I have thought about October 14th for a long time. So that I have thought about what I did and why I did it, and I have not found a way to justify it that I believe. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you that I know what I did and that I am sorry for it. That's all I have." Elise read the email twice. Then she drafted a response that was 1 sentence. "I received your email." She sent it and closed her laptop and went to make coffee and did not think about it again that night. She thought about it the next morning. briefly. Over the coffee, which was better coffee than the pod machine in the dorm room had ever made, a pour-over from a small bag of single origin beans that she had bought from a shop in the West Village and ground herself, which took 4 minutes and produced a cup that tasted like the thing it was supposed to be, not an approximation. She thought, it is possible to receive an apology without it meaning anything decisive in either direction. Oh, it is possible to hold in one hand the fact of the apology, and in the other hand, the fact of what required it, and to find that neither hand is empty and that no balance is necessary, that the thing you are doing is simply holding them both. She drank her coffee, she showered, she put on the charcoal blazer she'd had altered last month so that the shoulders sat correctly, which they now did, which made a specific difference in the way she moved through the particular rooms she was now regularly in. The rooms that were designed to assess and classify people rapidly, and where posture and fit, and the specific quality of being at ease were their own form of evidence. She took the train to work. The car was crowded at 8 in the morning, people pressed together in the specific anonymous intimacy of the city's transit system. Everyone looking at their phones, or at the middle distance with the same concentrated inwardness. She stood with one hand on the pole and looked at the darkness moving past the window between stations and thought about the files on her desk, which were good files, complex and consequential, the kind of work that requires everything you have. At Meridian, the elevator was faster than the one in the Boston building and didn't make the sound between floors. And her office was on 14 and had a window, a real window with a real view, and the desk was her desk now. Her files on the credenza, and her Margot Hill letter in the back of the document folder in the bottom drawer, and a small plant on the windowsill that she watered on Thursdays. She sat down and opened her laptop. There was an email from Diana Chu's assistant. The meeting was confirmed for the 3rd week of January, a working lunch at Halcyon's offices in Midtown. The agenda, the assistant's email noted, included preliminary discussion of a forensic advisory retainer. There was an email from Patricia Wren from the January dinner, forwarding a law review article on the evolution of beneficial ownership disclosure requirements under the Corporate Transparency Act with a note that said, thought this might be relevant to what you're working on. Let me know if you want to grab coffee and talk through it. There was an email from Victoria with the subject line, New Matter, initial briefing Friday, and no other text. There was an email from Dana Osei with a link to the Sigma Omicron Theta Spring regional event, and a note. You should be on the planning committee this year. You're good in rooms. Say yes. Elise looked at each of these in sequence. Out in the particular early morning quiet of the office before the day's noise accumulated, with the specific attention she had learned, over 12 additional years and one complete iteration of her life, was the most valuable thing she possessed. She opened Victoria's email first, then Patricia's, then Dana's, which she replied to in 5 words. Yes, send me the details. In February, Jared Whitmore accepted a negotiated resolution with the IRS that included a combined liability and penalty figure of $61 million. The agreed disgorgement of the transferred profits plus interest, plus a civil fraud penalty under IRC Section 6663, which applies when the IRS determines that any portion of an underpayment is attributable to fraud and the standard is met by clear and convincing evidence. And the evidence in this case was very clear and very convincing because it had been documented by someone who knew exactly what she was building and had built it well. The securities matter remained open for a period of months before resulting in a deferred prosecution agreement that required the company to retain an independent compliance monitor for 3 years and to make certain retrospective disclosures to the investors who had participated in the 2 fundraising rounds in question. Whitmore Distribution Partners was sold at a significant discount to its pre-investigation valuation to a regional logistics company in June. The Whitmore family retained the proceeds from the sale after satisfaction of the tax liability, which left Gerald Whitmore with a figure that represented a substantial reduction from his former position, but was not, in the way of these things, ruin. He was not the first man to have built something on a crooked foundation and then had to watch the correction happen at scale. He would not be the last. Serena moved to London in March. Elise knew this from the LinkedIn update, which she saw in the same peripheral, incidental way that you see things that are no longer centrally important, and which she registered and moved past. The SOT Spring Regional event was in April at a hotel in Boston. Elise was on the planning committee, which meant she arrived the night before and spent the morning of the event doing the specific low-ego work she had always been good at. Managing logistics, making sure the room was right, making sure people had what they needed when they arrived, and then spent the afternoon doing the other kind of work, which looked nothing like work from the outside, but which she had come to understand as perhaps the most important practice she engaged in professionally. The sustained, genuine, yet attentive presence in a room full of interesting people. At one point during the afternoon session, standing near the windows with a cup of actual good coffee from the hotel's decent catering setup, she found herself in a conversation with 3 women she had not met before. A second-year associate from a Boston litigation firm, a recent SOT initiate who was a first-year law student at Harvard, and a woman in her late 50s named Harriet Cross, who turned out to be the Cross of Meridian and Cross, Victoria's original founding partner, now mostly retired to advisory work, who had been at the Spring Regional every year for 30 years. Harriet Cross was small and direct and had the quality of someone who has stopped performing in any register because performance stopped being interesting to her a long time ago. She looked at Elise and said, "Victoria told me about you." "I hope favorably," Elise said. "She said you were the best analyst she'd hired in a decade. Victoria doesn't say things like that." "No," Elise agreed. "She doesn't." Harriet looked at her for a moment with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who has assessed a great many people over a great many years. "Where are you going?" she said. "Not geographically, as a professional matter." Elise thought about this. She thought about it with the full weight of the question behind it. The question being not simply about ambition or trajectory, but about intention, about what she was building and for what purpose and in what shape. "I want to build the kind of practice that actually catches the fraud," she said. "Not after it's already caused damage. Before. I want to be the point in the system where the structure is examined before the capital moves, not after. Honest, the gap in the current infrastructure is at the diligence stage. People are doing legal diligence and financial diligence and treating them as separate functions, and the space between them is where the most sophisticated fraud lives." She paused. "That's a 10-year project? Maybe 15. But that's where I'm going." Harriet Cross looked at her for another long, unhurried moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and said, "I'm glad I came this year." It was not an offer. And it was not quite an endorsement. It was the kind of thing that the right person says at the right moment in your professional life, the kind that you do not respond to with enthusiasm or gratitude, but with the specific quiet acknowledgement that registers its weight without overstating it. "Likewise," Elise said, and meant it. She walked back to her hotel room at 6 in the evening after the event ended and the room was cleared and the planning committee's post-event debrief was done. The hotel was in the back bay, a few blocks from Copley Square, and the evening was still light in the particular way of April evenings in the Northeast. The light lasting longer than expected, warmer than the air justified, the kind of light that is specific to this latitude and this season, and that she had missed, living in Chicago, in a way she hadn't been able to articulate until now. She stood at the window of her room on the 4th floor and looked out at the street below. The row of brownstones, the parked cars, a woman walking a very small dog with great seriousness of purpose, a kid on a skateboard making use of the smooth pavement outside the hotel entrance in the way kids have always made use of the smooth pavement outside hotels. She thought about the spring SOT regional events she had not attended in her first life. She thought about the dinners, the planning committees, the conversations, all of it foreclosed by the absence of a pin on a dress, a clasp that had never clicked closed, a night in a hospital waiting room that had been, in its quiet way, the structural linchpin of everything that followed. She thought about what it means to have a thing taken from you that was not, in its essence, a thing, that was a door, and behind the door were rooms. And in the rooms were people who were genuinely impressive and genuinely useful and genuinely interesting, who were building things that mattered and doing work that had consequence, and who would have, if she'd been permitted to enter, been the kind of people who pull you forward through the sheer force of the standard they set. She had been permitted. She had entered. She was in. She did not frame this as victory. Victory implies a contest, and a contest implies that the outcome was in doubt. And the outcome, she was increasingly certain, had never really been in doubt. Only the timing, only the years, only the question of which version of herself would be standing here at the window of the fourth-floor hotel room, looking at the small dog and the skateboarding kid and the long April light. She had a meeting in the morning with Harriet Cross, who had texted her at 7 p.m. to suggest breakfast at 8. She had the Diana Chu retainer, which was in its final drafting stage and would formalize in June. She had at Meridian 4 files in active work and 2 in preliminary analysis, and Victoria's standing Friday check-in, which had become, over the months, less a supervision structure than a genuine exchange between 2 people who found each other professionally interesting, which was its own specific form of respect. She had the Harvard first year's contact information, which the student had pressed on her at the end of the afternoon session with the particular eagerness of someone who has just identified a model they want access to, and which Elise had accepted with the quiet note to self that this was now part of her responsibility as well. Not just to use the network, but to be part of the structure of it, to be the person for someone else, that Dana had been for her, that Margot had been for her, that the long, patient infrastructure of Sigma Omicron Theta had been for the women before her and would be for the women after. She pulled out her laptop. She had a memo to finish before morning, a preliminary analysis for Victoria's new matter, 14 pages on a cross-border corporate restructuring that had 3 aspects she found interesting and 1 aspect she found alarming, and she wanted the alarming aspect properly documented before the Friday briefing. She opened it. She began to write. Outside, the kid on the skateboard had mastered whatever trick they'd been attempting, and she heard the sound of it from 4 floors up, the small, specific sound of a wheel on pavement, and then the brief, unmistakable silence of air, the moment before landing. She kept writing. It was in June, at the Halcyon offices in Midtown, that she had the conversation with Diana Chu that settled the shape of the next phase. The retainer itself had been agreed in principle for weeks. The lunch was the formality of it, and also, as these things often are with the right people, an opportunity for something more direct. Diana Chu was 41 and had the specific quality of energy of people who have been working at full capacity for their entire adult lives, and have found, somewhere in their 40s, that the energy has not diminished, but has become more precise, more directed, less diffuse, the difference between ambient light and a focused beam. She ordered plainly, a salad, water, coffee after, and spent the first 20 minutes of the lunch on the specific professional details of the retainer, which she had clearly read thoroughly and had specific questions about, and then set the papers aside and said, "Tell me what you're building." Elise had been asked this question twice now, by women she respected, and she gave the same answer she'd given Harriet Cross with certain elaborations. The gap in the diligence infrastructure, the space between legal and financial analysis, where the most sophisticated fraud currently operated, the 10 to 15-year project of building a practice that could operate across that gap systematically. Diana listened without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you need in year 2? Access to a client base with complex cross-border structures, matters where the financial forensics is genuinely difficult, not decorative. And a counterparty, a financial institution or a major institutional investor who has the incentive to fund really rigorous pre-investment diligence rather than post-incident remediation." Diana said, "I know a counterparty." She said it in the tone of someone who has already been thinking about this. "I'll make the introduction, on one condition." "What's the condition?" "You stay at Meridian for at least 3 years from the retainer date. I want stability in the advisory relationship. Well, I don't want to build on a foundation that's going to move." "I wasn't planning to leave Meridian," Elise said. "Victoria would find me before I got to the elevator." Diana smiled. A real one, the first fully unguarded expression she'd shown in an hour. "Victoria Langford has been right about 3 people in the 20 years I've known her," she said. "She told me all 3 of them at the time. You're the 3rd. Elise held this for a moment. "Who were the other 2? "Patricia Wren. And a man named Castellano, who is currently the head of the SEC's enforcement division." Diana picked up her coffee. "So you're in interesting company." Elise picked up her own coffee. It was excellent coffee, the kind that corporate dining budgets make possible. single origin, properly prepared, served in a real cup rather than a paper one, which is a small thing but accumulates over time. "I appreciate the company," she said. The summer passed in work. Late nights that tasted like takeout containers, and the specific cold of an office building's air conditioning in August, when the difference between the office and the street outside is 30 degrees, and you feel it every time the elevator doors open in the lobby. Early mornings that tasted like good coffee, and the particular quiet of a city at 6 a.m., when the light is clean and the streets have not yet filled with the day's noise. The satisfying, all-repeating rhythm of a practice that was growing with the specific momentum of something built correctly. Not fast, not dramatic, but inexorable in the way that well-built things are. She called her mother twice a month on Sunday evenings. Her mother, who was in her late 50s and lived in the house Elise had grown up in Cincinnati, worked part-time as a paralegal and had, for the last 10 years, it'd been developing what was turning out to be a genuinely impressive landscape practice in her backyard. Not landscape design, but the actual growing of things. The long, patient attention to soil and water and season that produces a garden that is interesting rather than decorative. She told Elise about the dahlias, which were coming in strongly this year, and about the neighbor's fence, which was falling over in a way that had become the minor ongoing drama of the back corner of the property. And Elise listened with the full attention she brought to things that mattered, which her mother's voice, in its familiar register, did. She did not tell her mother much about the work, not because she wanted to conceal it, but because the work, in its specifics, was not the part that translated. What translated was the broad strokes. It's going well. I like the people I work with. I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Her mother always said good and meant it simply, and moved on to the dahlias. In September, the Harvard first year, her name was Bia Okonkwo, she was 22, and from Lagos by way of London, by way of a full scholarship to Cambridge before she'd arrived at Harvard Law, sent a long email about a financial law course she was taking, and a specific question she had about the interplay between Section 482 and OECD transfer pricing guidelines in situations involving intangible assets. It was a good question. Elise spent an hour writing the answer, which ran to 4 pages and included 3 cases she cited not as authority, but as illustration, and which was, she recognized as she was writing it, the kind of answer that someone gave her once in a specific register of genuine engagement rather than professional obligation, and which had mattered more than any of the formal instruction she'd received. She sent it and went back to her files. In October, a year after Victoria's dinner invitation, 2 years after her initiation, she attended the fall SOT gathering in Connecticut. The same Connecticut house, the same old rugs, the same warm quality of a space that has been a gathering place for a long time and holds the memory of its function in its walls and floors, and the particular way the October light comes in through the windows. She wore the dark green dress again, it still fit correctly. She arrived early and stayed late. At some point in the evening, near the fireplace that had been lit against the October chill, she found herself standing with Clara Min, who had been chapter president when Elise was initiated and was now 3 years into a public interest law career in Washington. Clara, who had always been composed in the specific way of someone who has decided the mode of calm and maintains it with intention, looked at Elise across the top of her glass of wine and said, "Well, you know what I remember about your initiation year?" "Tell me," Elise said. "You were the last one there. You came in just at the start. The door had literally just opened, and you walked in like you'd been planning to walk through that specific door for years." Clara smiled. I thought, she knows exactly where she's going. Elise thought about the 8-hour night of lying awake on the narrow dorm bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. As she thought about the walk across the east lawn, the cold air, the light in the chapel windows. "I did," she said. She meant it. Across the room, someone she didn't know was being introduced to Harriet Cross by Dana Osei, and the specific quality of that introduction. Dana's hand briefly on the young woman's elbow, the way she angled her body to open the conversation rather than contain it. But the practiced naturalness of someone who has done this many times and understands what she is doing when she does it was its own kind of instruction, the living demonstration of how infrastructure works when it is working as it should. Elise watched it for a moment. Then she set down her glass and crossed the room. Victoria Langford was near the window, in conversation with two women Elise didn't know, and she did not intercept this but moved past it. Oz toward the younger woman Dana had just introduced to Harriet, who was standing now with the slightly charged alertness of someone in a room that matters for the first time. That was, she understood now, what the network actually was. Not a list of names, not a directory of titles and firm affiliations and graduation years. It was a practice. A repeated, active practice of showing up in rooms and paying attention and being useful and allowing yourself to be known in specific, genuine ways over time, so that when the moment arrived that required a name or a phone call or a door opened from the inside, you were already, specifically and undeniably, that name. She had spent 12 years in her first life being technically qualified and professionally invisible, which was not a paradox, but a description of what happens when you are very good at the work and have no way to demonstrate it to anyone whose demonstration would matter. Also, she had been a signal in a room with no receiver. She had been excellent in a frequency no one was tuned to. She was not invisible anymore. In November of that year, the Financial Crimes Practice Group at Meridian and Cross was formally announced as a distinct practice area, the firm's first structural reorganization in 6 years. Victoria's name appeared first in the press announcement as managing partner of the group, and Elise's name appeared second. Walk in the specific position that legal press releases use for the person who is understood to be the operational architect, not just a member, but a foundation. She saw it in the firm's press release on a Tuesday morning, reading it on her laptop at her desk, with a mug of the decent coffee from the good machine that the 14th floor had recently acquired because someone, she did not know who, but she had a theory, had decided that the floor's work had reached a level of consequence that entitled it to properly brewed coffee. She read her name in the release and felt the same thing she had felt when the pin clicked closed on her dress in the chapel. Not joy, exactly. Purpose. The specific, clean weight of being in the right place at the right function, doing the right work, in a context built specifically to make that work matter. She sent Victoria a one-line email. Saw the announcement. Thank you. Victoria replied in 4 minutes. Don't thank me. Come to the Friday briefing with the alderman matter fully prepared. There's a structure in there I want your read on before we meet the client. Elise was already reading the alderman matter. She had been reading it since Monday. There was a Thursday in December, 2 years and 2 months after her initiation in the old chapel. Sahi when she stayed at the office until 9:30 because the alderman matter had a cross-border tax structure she was still working through, a Luxembourg holding company with a series of Irish subsidiaries that were doing something interesting with royalty payments that was either highly sophisticated tax planning or highly sophisticated fraud, and the line between those two things was the exact line that her work required her to draw correctly and defensibly. She was alone on 14 at 9:30, just the hum of the building and the blue light of her screens. The Manhattan grid visible through the window as a field of lit windows and moving lights, the city continuing to do what cities do. She had a cold cup of coffee on her desk and a legal pad covered in the specific notation system she'd developed, not Margot's red pen system, which she'd absorbed and then modified into something that was her own. A hybrid of legal analysis shorthand and financial modeling notation that lived only in her handwriting and which no one else could read, which was fine because no one else needed to. She found the thing at 9:47, the specific thing in the structure that explained the whole architecture and made it definitively, not sophisticated planning, but deliberate misdirection. A single entity in the chain that appeared in the corporate registry under a filing date that was impossible, given the sequence of transactions that allegedly predated it, meaning either the sequence was misdated or the entity had been retroactively inserted into the corporate history, and in either case, the original disclosure was false. She circled it. She looked at it for a moment, and then she took a photograph of the relevant page with her phone, opened a new document, and began to build the memo. Outside, the city was doing what it does. Somewhere below 14 floors, a cab was making a sound that she had learned to tune out months ago. The building's HVAC system ran its quiet, constant operation. The coffee on her desk had gone entirely cold. She did not notice any of it. She was working. This was the thing, she thought. In the brief interval between completing one paragraph and beginning the next, this was the thing that 12 additional years of living gave you that no other experience could replicate. You knew, with specificity, exactly what you were doing it for, not in the abstract, not in the language of ambition or professional aspiration, in the concrete, lived, detailed specificity of someone who had experienced the alternative and found it unacceptable. She was building something. But the something was real. It would hold weight because she was building it correctly, from the foundation, with the right materials in the right sequence, with the kind of patience that is not passive waiting but active construction. Each piece placed and checked before the next one is set. She introduced herself. The young woman's name was Adaez. She was a second-year undergraduate, a Hartwell student, pledging SOT 2 years away from her initiation, and the long, branching thing that came after it. "First time at the fall gathering?" Elise said. "Yes." A pause, the specific pause of someone who is deciding how much of their own eagerness to show. "Is it always like this?" "What is this to you?" Adaeze looked around the room, at the women in conversation, the specific quality of ease and intention that the room held. "Like something real is happening," she said. "Yes," Elise said. "It always is." She raised her glass very slightly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. "Stick around, it gets better." She turned back toward the fireplace, toward the warm room and the October dark outside the windows, and she thought of one last thing before she let the evening simply be what it was. She thought about the $47 million, not as a figure, not as a statement of scale, as a detail in a larger structure. Because the thing that had always interested her about the way Gerald Whitmore had built his system was not the audacity of it, or the duration of it, or even the particular elegance of the mechanism he'd used. What interested her was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that the space between legal diligence and financial diligence would remain unoccupied, that no one would build a practice specifically designed to inhabit that gap, that the structural invisibility of the fraud was permanent rather than contingent. It was not permanent. It was only contingent on the absence of someone who was looking for exactly that thing in exactly the right way. She was that someone now. She had been building toward being that someone for 2 years in her second life, and for longer than that in the layered time of everything she carried. She would continue building. The practice would grow. The gap would narrow. Not because she was on a mission. She did not think in those terms, did not find them useful, but because this was the work, and she was genuinely good at it. And she had, finally, and completely and without qualification, the context in which good work could be done and seen and made to matter. Adaeze looked at her with the specific look of someone filing something away for later. "How long did it take?" she said. To feel like you belonged in the room." Elise considered the question in its full dimension. The honest answer was complex. It had taken her entire first life and then 2 more years on top of it. And the belonging she felt now was not the belonging of comfort or arrival, but the belonging of utility, of being specifically necessary to the specific function of a space. 2 years? She said, which was true for this life and true enough for all of it. Pay attention to every room you're in, not just to the people at the center, to the structure of it, how it's held up. Why? Because the room itself is telling you something, Elise said, about what it's built for, and whether you're going to be part of what holds it up, or just someone it admits for a season. She set her empty glass on the side table. The difference is entirely up to you. She moved toward the coat room because it was past 10, and she had the alderman matter on her desk, and the Friday briefing in 4 days, and the specific full satisfaction of work that deserves returning to. Her coat was where she'd left it. She put it on, said goodbyes. Brief, warm, specific. Shook Harriet Cross's hand in the way that means until next time. Stepped into the Connecticut night. The air was cold and smelled like leaves and wood smoke. Saw the stars were out in the dense way they are when you are far enough from the city's light to see what the sky actually contains. She got in her car and sat for a moment with the key in her hand, not starting it yet, just sitting in the dark and the quiet. She held 2 ages at once, 32 in the ledger of everything she had lived, 22 in the body the second chance had given her, and she did not try to resolve them. Must because they were both true simultaneously, and the truth did not require her permission to be complex. She started the car. The classical station, a cello moving through a sequence of intervals that were almost but not quite resolved, that kept returning to a note it had not yet finished with. She pulled onto the highway and drove toward the city and did not look back.